Good afternoon. A warm welcome to everyone joining us tonight for a very special event, Shon Faye in conversation with Christine Burns. A particularly warm welcome to our special guest. It's an enormous pleasure to be hosting two brilliant thinkers and hearing them discuss one of the most important books to have been published this past year, The Transgender Issue, an Argument for Justice. On behalf of the organisers, LGBTQ plus at CAM and the University of Cambridge Student Union LGBT campaign, I would like to thank Shon and Christine for kindly accepting our invitation and for being here with us tonight. I can't think of a better way to start LGBT History Month this year. In a moment, I will pass on to my colleague, Lucian Stephenson, who is LGBTQ plus at CAM's program coordinator, and who will also introduce our speakers. Shon and Christine will be in conversation until about 6:30, after which we will have about half an hour for questions from the audience. Although we can't all see each other, I can assure you that there are many of us here tonight. As you listen to our speakers, please do feel free to ask questions at any time during the conversation. You can post them into Q&A box, and as we move on to the Q&A around 6:30, we will pose as many of our questions of your questions as we have time for. So without any further ado, I will now pass on to Lucian, who will introduce our guests.
Thank you very much, Rob. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here this evening. We have two speakers that I don't think really need any introduction, but I must introduce them, for it is my job. It is a pleasure to invite Christine Burns back to speak for us here at the University of Cambridge. She did our LGBT History Month talk, I think in 2008. Wasn't it, Christine? It was a good time.
I lose track. And I know I was here for the Student Union talk in 18, and then I was back for the staff event in 19.
Yes,
then
gosh.
of course, I don't know what happened to 20, and after that it's all a bit vague. So, but yeah, I'm always happy. I'm always happy to come back here. My head teacher would be so proud.
Yes, so it's a pleasure to have you back again. It's always good to see you. It's always good to work with you. Christine, as you all know, has a 30-year legacy of working, putting through political change for the advancement of trans rights in the UK, for which she got an MBE for bringing about the Gender Recognition Act, I think in 2004. Was it 2004? It was, yes. And since then is an internationally recognised star of media reform and, of course, healthcare reform, which is what we like. And, of course, Christine is the editor of Trans Britain, Our Journey from the Shadows, which is 4 years old as of last month. Which you can, of course, pick up from Heifers at a 20% discount if you're in Cambridge with the ticket from this event. Very exciting. And of course, it is my intense pleasure to welcome Shon Faye to speak with us today, which is very exciting. Honestly, when Shon's book, Transgender Issue, came out last year in September, it was the first book that I pre-ordered in, I think, years. And I went and collected it from Heifers, actually, and then I walked back with it sort of like, which the people of Cambridge enjoyed, I'm sure. Shon, of course, is a writer, author, presenter of the podcast Call Me Mother, which is well worth your time, and I'll pop the link in the chat in a minute if you've not heard it already. I'm sure you have. And your book is now a full 4 months old. How many months is it
almost
since September?
actually 5 months tomorrow it's been out. And the paperback is in May, which is a little bit sooner than we initially planned, but I'm quite looking forward to that. And thank you for pre-ordering it as well. It does actually, like, at the time I didn't really think about it, but like pre-ordering a book is quite a commitment. I've never done it. So I'm very grateful considering how many people did it for me. So yeah, much appreciated, Lucian.
Yes, it's a book that manages to be both as radical as it is easy to encourage my own mum to read. So I appreciate that. Thank you for coming to speak with us this evening. And so the format, as Rob went over, is we're going to turn over to Shon and Christine, who will be doing a bit of discussing, and then we will be popping over to the Q&A, where we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. I hope that sounds good to you. You can write your questions in the Q&A box at any time. So good, right. So to start things off, Shon and Christine, you're both authors, you're both writers. So from your creating your books, your creative process of books, what have you learnt during that time, and how has that changed? How has what you've learnt during the process of writing your books changed going forwards? Does that make sense? Like, we're here now, your books have been published. What things are different now from what you were learning going into them?
I think, Christine, you should answer that first because your book has been out longer, so you've got presumably more to say.
Well, it's odd too, because for one thing, that my book is an anthology. So I've edited together the accounts of nearly 24 people to tell a historical thread that goes back over 50 years. So I picked out people to tell a particular part of that tale from an eyewitness perspective. And interestingly, I didn't tell any of them what anybody else was writing either, or what they'd been asked to do. So from a developing historian's point of view, I thought it was rather interesting that when I got the scripts back, there were lots of areas of concurrence, people who'd actually seen the same things in their lives and described them in similar ways. So I guess from a historian's point of view, you could say, okay, that looks like fairly safe history. Yet there were also 1 or 2 occasions where people had very, very different recalls of things, particularly people's recall of a particular gender clinician from the 1970s and early 1980s, a man called John Randall, who I always thought the received wisdom was that he was a bastard, because he behaved like that when he was featured on television. But I also found one of my contributors who actually had wound him round her little finger and thought he was super and got on with him really well. So that signals that in some cases, when you do this sort of pulling together of different opinions, that you think, okay, so there's more work to be done on that. But when we launched Trans Britain in January 2018, it felt like quite a tense time, because all of the stuff that we now regard as the backlash we've been living with for 4.5 years had only just got underway. When I sealed the manuscript and sent it off into production, it hadn't got underway at all. So I thought I was producing a book that was celebrating the fact of where we got to in the middle of 2017, and it all looked fine. And we had people starring in Orange is the New Black, and people were doing positive things about trans people, and it all looked rosy. And I thought, great, I'm retired, I can go off and do the garden now. And then halfway through proofreading, it all started to kick off. And I suddenly thought, oh my God, this book might actually have a more important role than I ever imagined, even though I didn't write it or create it with that political situation in mind. And then when we got to launch week, and I was saying to the publicists at Unbound, for God's sake, don't talk to that newspaper, don't talk to that newspaper, they'll only savage it. I was a bit naive about that, actually. I wish there had been more controversy, we'd have sold more books. But as it was, by that point, I thought this is a really hostile world. And being a fairly inexperienced author, I was scared stiff of the reaction that people would give to it, because I'm telling the history, the tale of every trans person in Britain, giving an explanation of how we got from the Dark Ages to nearly the present day. And that's very personal to people. And I know that if you get things wrong, then people can be very forthright about it. So I was a little bit afraid of how it would be received. And then I started to get people commenting back and raving about it. And I thought, oh, this is a bit odd, because I didn't expect it. And then it's gone on. And 4 years later, it's still selling remarkably well. We just sent 300 copies of the book to Conservative MPs. And I've had some thank you letters back as well. So it's if you like, it's a sort of backgrounder to this moment in time, this backlash, which I hope will end before too long. But it's certainly, I needn't have been as afraid. So I guess I've learned an awful lot from reading this, and it's also brought me into the opportunity to see a lot more books before they're published, to write reviews of them, and just become actually a proper author in terms of participating in the process of publication in general. But I'm also I'm jealous as hell of what Shon has written, because she has produced such an utterly brilliant book full of things which I keep reading and thinking, God, I wish I'd said that. So that's the long and short of it. That's my answer, I think.
Oh,
Shon.
thank you. That's that's so interesting. I think that because it is obviously the first month of LGBT History Month, and I think it's really interesting there what you said about the fact that some of the history matched up very well, different people's accounts, when you're trying to put together that sort of, and I think it's worth saying, isn't it, because with anything LGBT, a lot of it is kind of oral history, because it's not archived at the time, and because it's often in small communities, and it's what people can remember and piecing things back together. And we looked at some of that on my podcast as well, where you where you have I speak to obviously individuals who talk about their memories of events, but certainly some of those events are a bit contested. And I look a little bit in the transgender issue as well about some of these points of disagreement about what happened in LGBT history or trans history. And I think it's one of those areas where sometimes you just have to allow the fact that memory, like in a family where different siblings have very different memories of things, you have to allow that there is no one truth. It's not like a videotape you can play back. And actually, it can be quite interesting to see how those differences of opinion about what happened in the past influence now. In terms of what I learned, in terms of maybe when I was writing or coming to write the transgender issue, which was about 3 years ago right now, I was sort of in negotiation with Alan Lane, who did publish the book ultimately, and a few other publishers in January and February 2019. So by that time, unlike you, we were in the middle of the backlash, and obviously the book is kind of came into being because of the backlash. And I've explained quite a lot of length elsewhere, but I think it's worth restating that obviously I chose to write it because I was quite frustrated with the misinformation everywhere in the press. And I had been working as a journalist or opinion writer, trying to do these kind of like single pieces for The Guardian or The Independent or wherever, sort of trying to counteract the deluge of misinformation, repeated talking points, and starting to realize that part of the strategy was to just keep churning out the same talking points, knowing that because of the makeup of the media and certainly the lack of wherever there were trans people, they certainly weren't like staff writers, or they weren't people shaping the editorial content for the discussion of this topic, that really you were sort of fighting an uphill battle. So that was kind of what I intended to do. And I suppose when I was writing it, like, yeah, from 2019 to really last year when it went off to be printed, I was very nervous about the reaction I was going to get. I knew that it was not going to make me popular in some, even more unpopular in some arenas and corners of the internet than I already am. But I guess my biggest fear was apathy, because I think one of the strange things that a media consensus like the one we're living through, where there just seems to be such a hostile consensus, or certainly a monopoly of media discussion about what the priorities are and what we mean even when we talk about trans issues in the media, and which continues right up until, you know, last week, just this weekend gone. I think the concern I had was that actually no one would want the antidote, that perhaps it was part of an outrage clickbait cycle on Twitter and that people got angry, you know, but actually if it came to like a 300-page book written by a trans person, no one would really care that much to read it. That was my worst fear, actually, was apathy more so than hostility. And I suppose what has surprised me, and it's only been out obviously 5 months tomorrow, was that yes, there was hostile reaction to it, obviously, but actually not as much as I was expecting. And actually even the right-wing media, I was quite surprised with how seriously they engaged with the book. I didn't expect the Times or the Sunday Times to give me completely positive reviews of like a socialist trans manifesto, but they did review the book with a relative degree of respect for me and for my writing, and from the position I was coming from. Yeah, in general, the tone, at least of like the formal reviews, was pretty respectful. And interestingly, people took more issue with my left-wing views than necessarily my views on the sort of core trans politics. I assumed it was going to be all about my chapter on feminism and my chapter about youth healthcare, but actually people seem to have much more of an issue with my views on prisons, which is perhaps unsurprising, but actually I see it as a step forward that people are more objecting to the left-wing aspect than they are the trans aspect. And yeah, so in terms of the traditional media, the hostility that I had anticipated, the worst case scenario that I was probably fretting over before it was published in August, didn't come to pass. And then in terms of apathy, I mean, really, that I'm really glad to say that fear was unfounded. I think the book is, I'm not aware of like because the figures are kind of going up the whole time, but at the point now in hardback in the UK and Ireland, it's sold, I think, over 30,000 copies. At this point before paperback, and you know that's beyond what I was ever expecting. And I'm not saying that to brag. I wouldn't even be talking about the actual sales number if it were any other book. But I think the reason that the sales of this book are so heartening is because I don't know if you would agree with this, Christine, but I think because the media consensus has been going on for so many years, this hostile position and this kind of just agreement about how you can speak about trans people, the even quite the casually derogatory things you can say, the kind of even what the issues are all agreed upon by cisgender people who work in the media, and a small handful of them that seem to be obsessed, is that it's really heartening to realize that there was an appetite always for something else and for something that wasn't this, and that the reason that my book has sold well is because the media has not provided this in any way, shape, or form. Yes, of course, there are the odd occasional positive pieces, and there are trans writers who are doing work in British journalism coming through. So I'm not trying to erase anyone's work, but certainly I think the level of misinformation had kind of almost gaslit me into thinking is anyone going to listen to a trans positive argument? And I've been really heartened by that. And then on a more personal level, I mean, again, it's very early days, actually, 5 months in the lifespan of a book. And I have somewhat, I've been out promoting it, but part of me has not wanted to sort of freak myself out with engaging too much with the reaction to it. It's kind of like a child that you have that goes off to school and starts leading an independent life. I quite like that barrier between the book and me. However, I suppose the really tangible, interesting and sort of kind of marvelous things that you don't really anticipate when you're sat writing a book or when you plan it is hearing about the very individual specific circumstances. So for example, one family where I think there was a member of the family, an older member of the family that was perhaps hostile to some pro-trans arguments, or indeed maybe to trans people, because of what they'd read in the news. And a younger member of the family had created a reading group where they read a chapter of my book together and then discuss it as a family every month, I think, they'll do that for sort of 7 months. And they posted about it on Twitter, and then other families are starting to do that, and actually creating that sort of change at a very granular level with individual people and their family dynamics. It's just not something you think about when you're sat in your room fretting over a laptop. I've also had messages from people who said that they were very sympathetic to gender critical feminist arguments. They'll be very open about that with me on Instagram and Twitter before I got rid of it. And actually that they had a lot of sympathy for some of the talking points, and that the book had shifted their perspective, which of course is what it was written to do. Is that as much as it's nice to have people who were going to be allies anyway tell me that they enjoyed reading the book, and as nice as it is, to hear that LGB people, trans people liked it, feminists who were already on side, really it was written for the people who weren't already on side, not necessarily the people who are already very hostile, but the people who are teetering perhaps in their own minds on the brink of kind of not hearing any kind of counter arguments to the disinformation, which is what that sort of disinformation campaign is designed to do, is to slowly sort of create converts. So to arrest that process is obviously what a persuasive argument is designed to do. So I'm particularly grateful for stories like that, and that's kind of amazing as well, just to think that those arguments can kind of be having that effect out in the world, and at this point it'd be quite detached from me. And I'm not really privy to it. I mean, that's quite nice compared to the immediacy of social media, where anything you say has an immediate response, and often quite a hostile response, and you don't know if you're going to get dogpiled or screenshot for days. The idea that this can be out diffusing slowly in the world. And then the other thing is we've just had Christmas, and the sales were very good at Christmas, and I anecdotally gather that that's a lot of people who were buying it for family members, and I quite like that, because I think there was perhaps a slightly younger, more liberal, well, younger or more liberal and/or more liberal, let's say that, because obviously it's not always an age thing, younger and/or more liberal choir that I could have preached to. But obviously the way that these books pass around is by word of mouth, and it's great that that can happen within families, people giving it to their parents, people giving it to their uncle who's maybe said something a little bit dodgy about trans women or whatever. And so all of that stuff is quite mind-blowing, and I don't really think about it day to day, but even articulating it for you now it is quite mind-blowing.
Yeah, so I'm totally it's just, I'm just sitting here thinking that, when I was writing, maybe I was thinking to myself that this, my perception for a long time had been that I couldn't blame people for some of the attitudes they express, because I'm nearly 70 now, and I've grown up through decades and decades of the press misrepresenting us. That this is something that really started for me in the 1950s. If you in my book, I actually looked back further. I did some research with the British Newspaper Archive to try and find how the press covered us in the 1930s, 40s, and the early 50s. And I found, to my surprise then, that the press were actually not incensed by our existence. The stories that they found, although it's actually difficult sometimes to tell whether they're talking about a case of an intersex person or a case of what we would describe as a trans person, either way, they were intrigued and respectful in the most of the interwar years. They weren't looking for want of a better expression, clicks, I guess. And that didn't change until we got to the early 50s. And I think it probably started because so many of the stories before that had actually related to people who were going from supposedly female to male. And I think, yes, socially, that's regarded as being a far more laudable project. You know, who wouldn't want to aspire to being a man? Whereas at the beginning of the 1950s, the world had the story of Christine Jorgensen, who needed, in any case, to sell her story in order to make the money to survive. And it was made into quite some, a lot of shocking press from that on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think people are far more frightened at the idea, particularly of an attractive trans woman, because of the fears that maybe they don't articulate about this woman being made of bits of man, in their view, and their difficult relationship with homosexuality. And so the emergence of trans women, first, visibly Christine Jorgensen, and in Britain, Roberta Cowell, I think created a far more of a true moral panic in the press. And so you then have the stories. I'm desperately trying to think of a word, but making a big fuss out of these women and exoticizing them, I suppose, and also making them figures of danger. And that's actually, I think, then moved on to the press settling on the idea that the role of trans people in editors' minds was, particularly for tabloids, to sell Sunday newspapers. And it became a case of chasing people down, outing them, and then treating them as though they had been tracked down as criminals. So you get Michael Dillon, respectable doctor, who was going around the world as a ship's doctor, who, on the exposure that he was a trans man, was tracked down to the quayside in New York, and was so traumatized by the experience that he had that he went off and became a Tibetan monk. And then we have the outing of April Ashley, a successful model, a beautiful trans woman, who, having been outed, her work simply dried up. Eventually, she left the country, but not before she'd had the terrible experience of her divorce from Arthur Corbett. So we were figures of controversy, and figures to I suppose, to act as a cautionary example to others. And I was growing up in that. I learned about that there were people like myself when I was about 12 in the News of the World in 1966. And I often say that I simultaneously learned that there was other people like me, but also that it was a very bad thing to be. So you then get this model established in the press, which I don't think has changed very much since, where certainly with the tabloids, we were there, as I say, to be the shock and the horror that fills the inside pages of Sunday newspaper and sells papers. And for occasionally for the broadsheets to tut over, particularly if cases came to the courts, as they did in the mid-80s, with a trans man taking Britain to the European Court of Human Rights, and he didn't win, but it was something for them to talk about. So we went into the 80s and then the 90s with an established model for the press to represent us. One thing they never did, really, was to let us speak for ourselves. Even in books as well, the books of the era tend to be the kind of sanctioned autobiography or ghost-written biography that was judged by publishers to appeal to a cisgender audience. So that we never, for decades, we never really got to speak for ourselves or tell our story. And if we made any social advance or legal advance, as we did with Press for Change in the 90s, when we won a case, the press would go absolutely bananas. I remember we won a case on the right of trans people to be treated on the NHS, and the Daily Mail went absolutely doolally the next day, and the rest of the press followed. So we've arrived in the last decade at the end of a time when I think almost everybody who works in journalism has grown up on that stuff. They've been fed the output of their predecessors, and that's their starting point for understanding Shon and myself. So a growth in books by trans people in any genre has been incredibly welcome. You know, my contribution, I felt I could write about history. Shon has written brilliantly about the social implications and the political implications going forward, of the things that society can benefit from by understanding what we're saying. So I've learned from this whole process, actually, how important books were. I think I've grossly underestimated their value in political debate. And I'm really glad that we're in a golden age at the moment, I think, when there are so many books coming forward which give food for thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're in a kind of, well, there's always a precedent, but let's say a renaissance of trans people publishing books and pushing the different forms in which trans people come on both sides of the Atlantic, both in fiction and non-fiction. I mean, I think last year there was just so many books, whether connected specifically to talking about transness or not, by trans authors. And hopefully that's something that in an industry like publishing will continue, because obviously you hope that it's sort of proven that it can sell. So I'm hoping that we are seeing more of that, particularly in Britain too, because I think in the US, because it's interesting, you were just talking there about looking at the British tabloids, and I'm sure we will go on to this about the specific nature of transphobia in Britain. It's something that I get asked about a lot. Obviously, my book is coming out in the United States and Canada in this September, so I will probably go and tour it there. And I anticipate that a lot of that tour will be Americans asking me, what's wrong with your country? Why have they got such, especially on the liberal, like, East Coast and West Coast, they'll be asking me what's going on over there. And I suppose I'll have to indulge it for a bit and then point out that the US isn't perfect. So Americans.
But it is weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
I expected it from America with its evangelical religious right. For whom we are, we're the worst possible thing in creation. I didn't expect it, probably because I've worked in the politics for nearly 30 years over here, successfully, if slowly. Even though we had this nonsense going on in the press, we still were able to get our messages across to rational people. And explain our case and make progress on the facts. And that actually, I think, is the thing, that was the key to our success in Press for Change. We were created because of the realization that if nobody else was listening to us, and that I mean that we couldn't put our case across in the press, that life is beastly to trans people. There's no audience for that. And we couldn't go to politics because no MP would see that there were votes in supporting trans people. So our strategy, when we saw that there was something that would work, was to set up a campaign based around using strategic legal cases, which came to us organically. We didn't construct the cases. We just had people come to us with their particular problems, and they perfectly exemplified the problems we were trying to solve. And we'd found that in the law, judges and juries and whatever are not interested in fake news. They're interested in the facts, and provided we could present the facts of our discrimination cogently enough, we could make progress just by building canonically on established law. And we made all our progress on that basis. After 4 years of existence, Press for Change succeeded in creating the precedent in the European Court of Justice that said that it was a form of sex discrimination to discriminate in employment against somebody who was planning to undergoing or had undergone gender reassignment. And that was big business, because even though it wasn't the thing that we were set up to do, which was to enable people to change their birth certificates and protect their privacy, it was a key step, and it also validated our method. So I'm very conscious now that the activists of today don't have that avenue, I think, much anymore. I mean, where it does exist, it's being done very, very competently by the Good Law Project. But it really marks a difference in approach between what we were doing in the 90s, and through that, creating the necessity for a reluctant government to pass an addition to the Sex Discrimination Act in 1999, to accept that an appeal court ruling meant that NHS trusts could no longer play silly buggers and discriminate against trans people in terms of referrals to gender identity clinics, and ultimately that there needed to be a mechanism to recognise the social fact of permanent gender change through the Gender Recognition Act. So all of those things came about by having recognised that if you can establish your principle in law, then government has to do something. We've moved on since then. I always thought that by the time we got to about 2007, we'd probably just about exhausted the things that we could do with the law. We still had to pass the Equality Act, but essentially we'd done the things that the law was there to do for us, to provide a substrate for social progress. But then the next step would always have to be social change. As I used to put it, to make it literally unthinkable to discriminate against trans people in the same way as it has become largely unthinkable to discriminate against gay men and lesbian women. I mean, people still do it, but it's looked on in the same way as driving without a seatbelt. So, what was I going to say? I guess with the change, and probably it coincided with my generation of activists deciding to step aside and let a new generation come on, was that we'd moved into this area of winning hearts and minds, so that further progress was made by people just getting to know us, knowing a trans person. One of the most exciting things we ever did was to get a character into Coronation Street. It's played by a cisgender person, but the things she went through taught a lot of people by walking in a trans person's shoes about what we were at. And so that was the sort of progress we were beginning to make at the beginning of the immediately preceding decade in 2010. We ended with Orange is the New Black with, I can't remember her name.
Laverne Cox, yeah.
Thank you, Laverne Cox. And we had Time magazine referring to a trans tipping point, and lots of other people writing in that way of trans people having, I suppose, socially arrived. And as I think I said to you when we spoke in Manchester, you know, that was the sort of thing that was our bad move, because suddenly we were in the sights of the people who would rather we didn't make progress. And that's I think where you can trace the roots of this immense lashback or backlash now. I mean, what do you think, Shon?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I agree with a lot of what you say about whether I think it, in terms of the work that Press for Change did, and in terms of legislative change, a lot, especially by the passage of the Equality Act, had been done. And I think it's interesting because a lot of the contention, which maybe people who are watching are familiar with, but if they're not, you know, even some of the stuff that has become really heated on social media, for example, about single-sex spaces and trans people, you know, the Equality Act and the exemptions that are often cited in that, about whether or not there might be times where you could exclude a trans person. They haven't really been tested in case law, which would actually suggest that they've probably been working practically quite well. The law is probably, you know, the fact that it hasn't needed to be tested by case law suggests that it's probably not perfect, but it is working quite well. And actually, a lot of the laws that we have, at least in statute in the UK for trans people compared to the US, which is something I probably will have to point out, as I say, when I'm on tour in the US, compared to a lot of states in the US, are pretty good in terms of non-discrimination against trans people. You're right not to be discriminated against. In theory, I think the problem is access to justice so going beyond the letter of the law. The issue, I think, one of the things that I was keen to point out, because I think because our laws are better than a lot of laws in the US, it's very easy for people to make the argument, well, what rights haven't you got? It's a lot better to be trans here than anywhere else. And the reality is that that's only one part of the puzzle. In the same way as with gay rights, for example, you can, you know, two men can get married to each other now, but there are still parts of the UK where it wouldn't actually be safe for them to walk down the street hand in hand. So there's two very different things there about your theoretical freedoms and rights and your capacity to actually enjoy them. And when it comes to discrimination against trans people, a lot about it is about a deterioration in material conditions for lots of people, to anyone that's not very rich, that has probably occurred since the 90s. We've moved increasingly to the right in terms of parliamentary politics. The standard of living has declined. Poverty is on the increase. We had 10 years of austerity, and all of these things don't necessarily automatically are seen as trans issues, but of course they are trans issues because they affect everyone, and particularly people who aren't rich, and trans people are not likely to be rich as a rule. And so the question of discrimination is how many trans people have access when we've had cut legal aid, how many trans people have access to justice if they've been discriminated against in the workplace? Very, very few. I mean, just even anecdotally amongst the people I know, friends, you know, who have been discriminated against in the workplace, is there any hope or prayer of them taking that to a tribunal? Not really. And of course, working conditions have become more and more precarious, and you can circumvent a lot of employment law by just keeping people on certain contracts, etc., which does catch a lot of trans people, as it catches a lot of marginalized and minority workers. So I think the change that is necessary. The other thing too, I think, is sometimes the explosion. I think what the focus of maybe the 10 years up to 2020 was this kind of more visibility activism, and trans people feeling more comfortable being out and saying, you know, I'm I'm trans and I'm still a man, I'm still a woman, but I'm a trans one, because I think there was a discouragement from sort of saying that sort of thing. You were supposed to go through a transition process and then you change sex and that was it, and you blend back into society. And so there was a lot of benefit for that, but there are also material impacts of that too. So, you know, the gender identity services we have, I mean, perhaps they worked when very, very few people were coming forward to even access them. The gender identity clinic system, when it was really a handful of patients a year. But of course, with the swell in visibility means the swell in people who are exploring gender, who maybe feel liberated to, to medically intervene with their gender, to live in ways that are outside the binary of male and female, etc. And the gender identity clinic system that grew up in the 20th century for what was believed to be a very, very small handful of people doesn't work. So there's a kind of a problem with the surge in visibility, and then the material impact of that is we have ever-growing waiting lists and a bottleneck because the system hasn't changed to realize the fact that being trans is still quite rare, but it's not this tiny, rare mental illness as it was conceived of in the 20th century. So there's an aspect of perhaps some legal changes allowing people to be more comfortable to be visible, and then more visibility also meaning that some of the social system, the political systems, institutions haven't really caught up with the rapid changing visibility of trans people in society. Also, I think with visibility too, a lot of people, one of the challenges is that I think, a lot of people, started to have a problem with trans people when they didn't even know that they'd existed before. You know, that often there's this like idea that trans people, sort of popped up with Tumblr in 2012 or whatever. And like anything, like any kind of minority who starts to become more visible and starts to become more comfortable being open in society, there has always been backlashes to that, unfortunately, with every civil rights movement and with every liberation movement. And I think it's probably worth saying that, I don't know if you would agree with this, Christine, but I think probably you did talk about the media reaction when you were working for Press for Change, and sometimes when you won a case or whatever, that the Daily Mail would kick off or whatever. But again, I still think to a lesser extent, there wasn't the level of organization to this anti-trans movement that there is both in Britain and around the world. It takes different forms across the world. In the US, it's very much the Christian right. And in Hungary and Poland, you see this kind of obsession amongst far-right people of gender ideology and the subversion of gender roles. And in Britain, I think it's become more of a culture war thing, is that with Brexit, with COVID, with the level of corruption that we see in Britain, I mean, as we all saw yesterday in Parliament, the level of kind of corruption at the heart of public life, it's just very, very useful to the establishment to have scapegoats. And I think whereas there was always kind of what are these freaks doing every time trans people maybe made a few headlines in the 2000s, it's really, really become in the interests of an elite to have a range of scapegoats and to keep pumping out misinformation and to sell papers and to distract people with culture war issues. And trans people, unfortunately, just because of where we were coming in terms of visibility, have happened to be one of the targets in that broader culture war. And I think that's really different. The other thing that was occurring to me about when you said about how the time for legislation is passed is, or not the time for legislation, the time for sort of strategic litigation is less, it's perhaps less of an effective tool now than it once was, is that, of course, that we have a very organized anti-gender movement in the UK, and they have taken to using strategic litigation. And we've seen, obviously, with the change in technology, people are able to crowdfund large amounts of money to do lots of test litigation to actually try and roll back or curb policies, practices, statutory instruments, whatever, the guidance that help trans people, with actually very little real success. But we are seeing a lot of it, a lot of legislation, you know, and it's kind of almost like throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks. And actually, fortunately, very little of it has. But I think that's new. I don't know. That's not something you were perhaps facing, is that we have a very kind of very mobilized, obsessive, and a very easily able to self-fund movement now, that definitely, at least, because, you know, even when it's not successful, can also distract a lot of energy and time and focus away from activists now.
Yeah, I do feel sometimes as though they've stolen the successful parts of our playbook, because, as you say, you know, our trick was to find cases which were winnable and perfectly illustrated the point that we wanted to advance on. They're not doing it in quite the same way, and we relied on the largesse of lawyers who were prepared to do the work pro bono, with us running around doing the work of their juniors. So there is that similarity, and I'm losing my thread here. But what did I want to say? Yeah, there are other factors that have changed. Obviously, we didn't have crowdfunding in those days. We didn't have social media, and that's probably as far as I can go with that. I think they've copied a lot of that. Oh, the other thing, of course, we did in the way we organized our activist campaign is we managed to look a lot bigger than we really were. The core of Press for Change throughout the 90s was 4 of us in our spare bedrooms, or for me, most of the time, it was in a hotel room, because I was doing a day job and then coming home and going back to my hotel room and plugging in. Instead of watching the television, I was doing emails and writing web pages. So I think they've copied some of the bits from us that work, particularly the ability to make something that's probably no more than a woman and a dog look like a big, credible organization. I've never seen so many logos and corporate brandings suddenly appear on the scene as they were in late 2017, when so many of these groups just suddenly sprang out of the earth as though there'd been a shower of rain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, one of the things that's probably worth thinking about, is what is necessary to move forward, considering this is the landscape now. And I obviously try and touch and make some of these arguments in the book. And so I would say, so some of these things these battles now are more granular. So one of them being healthcare. Which is obviously so central, and I'm sure you know this too, is when I worked for 4 years at Stonewall, which we can talk about later maybe, the controversy around Stonewall and this kind of completely synthetic, confected media, where it's sort of all of the things that were attributed to Stonewall. As someone that worked there for 4 years, almost like it's run by a secret army of trans people, maybe trans women more likely, that it's assumed to be, when in fact it's run by mostly cisgender people, and actually there's very few trans people that work there. When I worked at Stonewall, I worked as a trans engagement officer, and that was designed to build better relationships between Stonewall and trans people. And I worked in Wales mostly at the time. And the reason being, of course, because Stonewall historically hadn't done much with trans people. And so trans people were quite suspicious when Stonewall added the T on. So my role was partly to try and build those relationships, where they were often quite frustrated, particularly with older members of the trans community, for good reason. And when as part of that role, I spent 4 years going to kind of community groups, and these were like meetups, social meetups, not big activist groups, people, meeting once a month to meet other trans people in their area and have tea and biscuits. But inevitably, what the conversation always turned to was healthcare. And that's what a lot of those groups became, really, was, chats, catching up, maybe giving people guidance, giving people support if they're being harassed in their local area, all those kind of community things. But a lot of it came back to healthcare discrimination and to the waiting lists and to depression as a result of that. And so I think why I raise this is because this is the dissonance between the media narrative about what trans issues are and what actually trans people are talking about. Because trans healthcare, apart from a few places like Vice and maybe Galdem, so younger media, there is no media interest in trans people. And there's always this sort of like, well, of course trans people deserve better healthcare, but I want to talk about the census, or I want to talk about I don't know, the Olympics or whatever. But the reality is that is a huge crisis. So it's almost 5 years now for, you know, where it really should be 18 weeks by NHS guidance. 5 years from referral by a GP to even a first appointment at a gender identity clinic. And again, the kind of mental health impact of that. Last year, you know, it was covered in the news, and I didn't know her personally, but a trans woman, Sophie Gwen Williams in London, took her own life. For a variety, you know, she was been struggling with her mental health for a long time, but certainly one of the things that happened in her life in the weeks leading up to her being that depressed was that she had moved from Ireland, Northern Ireland, to London, and she had to go back to the bottom of a waiting list that she'd already been waiting on for years. And so, you know, I think, as we always hear, is you can never really attribute one cause to anything to someone's death, one cause to suicide, but certainly that was news that she received in the weeks leading up to her taking her own life. And unfortunately, these stories are dotted around the trans community in the UK. It is a huge crisis, and even it doesn't have to get to that desperate point for people to be having such a huge negative impact. And the problem here is it's not quite as easy. I think Good Law Project, I think it's good that there are now people looking at this in terms of doing it through the courts. But a lot of the activism that's needed is kind of the difficult work of pilot schemes, bugging and becoming a nuisance to local clinical commissioning groups. Trying to get community-led services with trans people involved in the governance, maybe expanding out sexual health services. And all of this stuff is a little bit harder because it's not very glamorous. It takes a long time. You have to be really, really dogged about it. And one of the issues I think that the LGBT community and the trans community in the UK have a little bit is we're not very joined up at this point in time. There are lots of different groups that I've spoken to, had contact with across the country, who are trying to do the same things. And sometimes I think there's a variety of reasons why they're not as good at talking to each other, because I think with a bit more joined up thinking, actually these small voices could become much more impactful. And this is what I say about the distraction of the media debate, because it's very easy for people to get het up about what, I don't know, certain authors, certain comedy writers, whoever, I'm not going to name them, say on Twitter. And this is not just trans people, this is maybe gay allies, lesbian allies. Very easy to get caught up in that outrage cycle, but it is a distraction from maybe some of the more unglamorous or the less reactive work that might need to be done on the ground. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I think one thing you've raised there, which has struck me before, is that there is quite a big structural difference now between how trans people organise and how we did in the past. Long before there was a Press for Change, from 1965 onwards, so by the time Press for Change was created, that's 25 years and more, the only organisation of trans people was self-help groups. Some of those actually were registered charities and others were more informal than that, but the emphasis was on helping each other to survive the system as it was. People just didn't credit the idea that there would be any mileage in trying to actually change it by trying to work the levers, whether trying to get onto boards or making protesting or even using the law. And when we became the activist front in 1992, we were essentially the only game in town. And being a small group led by ostensibly 6 vice presidents, but we're all very independent. And actually, we just talk to each other a lot on the phone and would decide what to do on a step-by-step basis. We knew that because we were the only people doing that, that everybody else looked to us. So our strategy was the trans community's strategy. And since we were very narrow in our original objective of what we wanted to do, we wanted to create a means for people to be able to change their birth certificates, because birth certificates were the root of so many problems for trans people, going back to the end of the 1960s. So it was very easy to have a strategy and to stick with it. And I think the difference that struck me, since we sort of faded out into the background and left it to other people, is trans people now are organized in a very fragmented way. There are lots of groups and individuals, and we tend to be moving in much the same direction because the problems are the same as seen by everybody, but we're not actually setting priorities in the same way that Press for Change did. I think there's enormous advantages in the way that trans people structure their activism now, but I think also we've lost something from that, and I think that makes it difficult for, we were very, very clear that we had to ignore the distractions. We knew exactly what we were going for, and because there were so few of us, if something came up in the press, then we were very effective at saying, if we rise to this, does it take us towards our goal? And if it didn't, well, we will just ignore it. And since we also controlled the levers of communications in the community, we were able to do that in a very effective way. So we were not distracted from our goal, and we just plugged on to do what we want to do. And actually, when we started widening our communications, when we set up forums for people to discuss what they thought, in fact, it became a problem because something bad would happen and then everybody would erupt, and we'd spend the next two weeks just trying to tamp it down so we could get back to the job we needed to concentrate on doing. So I'm in complete agreement with you that I think nobody is really setting a focused agenda for trans people to say, the thing that we really want to do and the thing we want to continue talking about, no matter what appears in the Sunday Times this weekend, is this. And I think actually in your book, you've articulated an agenda extremely well in that way. You could take that and you could say, if everybody sticks to this, we'll actually make some progress towards those things which are very important to do.
That's very kind, although I do not want the responsibility for being an agenda setter or any way hierarchical activism. It's not my bag. But I think the and there's of course the difficulty is that I think we have to probably here it's worth saying that if we look at the British, when we say trans community, we're using a shorthand, but now fortunately, because there are more people who are identifying themselves as trans, there isn't one community, and there are very, very different priorities. Something I try and highlight in the book is, a lot of the stuff that we had this kind of, we've had this sort of several years struggle, which was the catalyst for this backlash in the media, was the Gender Recognition Act. But actually, a lot of people, it's not their priority, particularly working class trans people, particularly trans people of color, where homelessness is much more, for example, and access to housing. And in some ways it's an easier thing to think about. Here are the legislative things we want, which of course is necessary, and Press for Change did that, and Stonewall continues to do that. Is here are the legislative changes we need, and it is important to have the law changed because that that underpins everything, and ultimately that is, for better or worse, as imperfect as a legal system might be, it is what you fall back on. But I can see that for a lot of people that can feel quite remote from their lives and from their priorities and from their material conditions, particularly when well, we see, as I say, that it's the new levels of visibility out in society is producing new problems. Well, not new problems, but in greater number than there were before. So at the younger end, people are coming out younger. All sounds nice, but obviously that can increase a younger population who experience family rejection and therefore poverty and homelessness. And of course, that's inflected a lot by religious background, by ethnic background, where in the country you live, etc. And of course, at the other end of the scale is an aging trans population who are, you know, not in these heteronormative nuclear family units always, where, I mean, that model doesn't work for a lot of heterosexual cisgender people. This idea that your children will look after you, and actually finding themselves, you know, growing older in a state that was told that, you know, you were told that you might be cared for from the cradle to the grave, but in the reality is not, that's not the case often. And for trans older people, there is a lot of fear about health and social care settings for them as they get older, because it makes them, they're extreme, as all older people can become once again very vulnerable. And these are new problems, I think, in terms of the scale at which we're seeing as the trans population is expanding. And I suppose the difficulty, and I don't have the answers here and now, I think the difficulty is, again, as you know, I say in my book, is that it's not as simple as a legal change. It's about the entire social safety net. And that's why my argument is that it would benefit everyone. It's because a lot of these things, you know, housing benefit, universal credit, the social safety net for older people, and social care as people get older and age. I mean, yeah, these affect people, cisgender people, far greater numbers than they do trans people. And so for me, the priority, I think at this stage, if I were to be so grandiose, is I think we as a movement, if I can say that, need to think a bit more about joined up thinking with other groups as well, because the times in which we're finding ourselves with increasingly right-wing hostile governments is that actually a lot of what's happening to trans people, it's very easy to get lost in the media narratives in the way that we're specifically targeted, but it's happening to a lot of other groups. And I think we're not going to be able to do it on our own, realistically, depressingly. There aren't enough of us. And certainly this sort of social change, it's brought about by coalition, particularly in times where, as we are in now, where we don't have the era of government at all. I think a lot of that stuff has to be, you really have to have a view to the future and building solid partnerships with other allied movements. And there are some good green shoots of that, I think, if we want to be optimistic against all that gloom about the Tories. I think the LGB movement, certainly, I don't know if you would agree, because you probably have a longer historical perspective on this, but certainly even 10 years ago, when I was sort of hanging around more on the LGBT scene, on the gay scene in particular, the transphobia, or at least the ignorance about trans people amongst cisgender gay men was quite high, not always intentionally, but like language being used is quite derogatory, complete ignorance. And I would say that has reduced a lot, and that's partly in response to the backlash we've seen, is that I do actually think, especially amongst millennials and younger, there's quite solid ties now between the LGB movement and the T, and a greater understanding of why we all have to kind of stand together.
Yeah, and I think that's actually been an unintended consequence of the backlash against us, that it actually has drawn the whole of the LGBT and the intersex communities together. I agree with you, but if you look back to the first half of the 90s, I remember in 1995, I think it was, that we at Press for Change decided that we were going to have a marching group in London Pride for the very first time. And it was, the unexpected actually was the amount of homophobia from our own followers, because there are a lot of people who I think falsely believed that they would get their rights if they weren't perceived as being associated with gay men and lesbian women. That was their homophobia coming out. And similarly, a lot of people pressing for more social gains for gay men in particular feared the association of lots of trans women being visible within that. Again, particularly actually that happened even more so, I think, in America, where there was a really definite move to try and push the trans people back because it was thought tactically that it would endanger the efforts to make gay positive laws. It was so much of the gay movement in America was assimilationist. It was about young, rich gay men who, if they didn't tell you, you'd not known they were gay men, and consequently not feeling that having the trans women tagging along as well was bad news for their argument that, look, we're just the same as you. We just want a few of these loose ends tying up. I remember going to events where I felt incredibly unwelcome because they knew I was coming in as a trans woman. I remember there was one, I won't shame the union, but I was sent to talk to a well-known union, and by lunchtime, the women's caucus in the union had got together and decided that I had to be ejected. That was the state that things were in those days. And there were lots of places we couldn't go. In my book, people talk about knowing of the pubs that were safe to go to, not because of the cisgender landlords, but because of the gays and lesbians who regarded that place as being their own. And I remember towards the end of the 90s, we actually finally started to make progress in helping a lot of unions to go from being LGB to being LGBT, and a lot of internal feeling about that. So there has been a big progressive move, I think. And to come back to what you were saying, I think that has actually helped to cement us more. And I think that's why one of the factors in this culture war is to try and prize us apart again. It's strategized by evangelicals, particularly on the right in America, that they want to prize away the trans element of LGBT, to divide us, because it's easier to pick us off individually than the thing that won us marriage equality was our incredible cohesion and ability to work together. Even though marriage equality for gays and lesbians wasn't actually going to benefit trans people, we were still working on it together and providing moral support. So, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I was thinking about that. I think it's very interesting that you raised that. It's something I found when I was doing the research for my book as well about, like these, I love the fact that history is uncomfortable and it shows up things that surprise you. Yeah, and the reality is that I think historically there was prejudice on both sides, because what you had was like two related actually groups in terms of how they were seen by societies, and basically gender deviance. Either you're sleeping with the wrong person or you're dressing as the wrong person was basically how society thought of you. And so, and sometimes both. And I think it's worth saying there is that, and they've both been pathologized, of course, that like both homosexuality and transsexualism were in the DSM. They were both. And so they've been distinguished from that point, and there is an anxiety there, and that exists again, in civil rights struggles, is this, respectability politics. And I think if we're all honest, we can all fall prey to it at times, when you feel besieged by the mainstream and you're desperate to understand. I found this even doing a tour for my book, is that you feel like you suddenly go into these mainstream spaces and you really feel you have to be on your best behavior, whatever that means, even when that's not really what I believe. But suddenly the pressure comes, and Yeah, I mean, sometimes I love when trans people just don't seem to care about appeasing people like that. I do, but then I'm always a little bit nervous too. Like, always this is, that's a natural reaction to have. And I think what happened with the gay movement and the trans movement was, you had two groups who were trying to work out ways to appease society. So you had some trans people on the one hand saying, well, I've got a medical condition, and so we need to make it like a medical condition that's treated, and gay people are sexual deviants. And then you had kind of gay people who were saying we should be making an argument for like what people do in their own bedrooms is fine, but actually, in the out and about in the world, I'm not causing you any problems, but trans people are a bit peculiar. And so you had that kind of reactionary nature on both sides, I think. But the reality is that I think the reason that they reacted like that to each other is often it's like when you take against someone because they have traits that remind you of yourself. It's a bit like that, really, isn't it? Like a colleague that for some reason you can't work out why you don't like them, but actually someone points out to you it's because you've got similar traits, or you're worried that some trait they have is something that other people, they're a bit loud and brash, and you're always a bit worried that you're too loud and brash. And I think a lot of that history has, I would say we're in a new era with that, in that case, and that I do think genuinely with and I think it's changed whilst I've been an adult, and I'm in my early 30s. And when you look at LGBT youth groups and youth prides and things like that, certainly gay teenagers and trans teenagers where they're out, in school or in youth clubs or whatever, there is this coexistence now where they do, I think there is much more cohesion and understanding that they're part of the same community or group, for want of a better word. And that's positive.
I think young people can see many more options now, and that makes it a lot easier. I remember when I was young and starting to come out to myself, that the menu of options back in the 1970s was, are you a TV or a TS? Are you transvestite or transsexual? And those were the only things that you could be. They're both medically defined, and you were sort of choosing which you could be. So it wasn't actually easy to think yourself as being, well, actually neither of those suits fits very well. I don't, but I'll plump for this one because it comes closer. And you saw in the 70s and the early 80s, I think a lot of people, particularly people who would went to go on and physically transition, that they might start hanging around for a long time with the cross-dressing community to see if that was good enough for them. Because if dressing up now and then, maybe once a week, and talking to other people about it, took the fire away, then maybe that's the way to work through life, is find something to damp down the problem. And then eventually people find that doesn't work, and eventually they go on and transition anyway. And that contributes, I think, to a lot of the difficulty that outsiders have in understanding the different trajectories and motivations of those groups. But it wasn't until the beginning, I think, of the noughties. I remember the first time I came across somebody talking, they didn't even use the word non-binary, but it was something that amounted to that. I'd never seen anybody discuss that possibility, because the politics of our position forced us to one extreme or another, and not to consider the possibilities of being somewhere in the middle. Even though we had language for that, transgender was supposed to accommodate some of that ambiguity in the middle. Whereas transsexual was definitely a binary thing about crossing right over from the extremes of being one thing to another. But I still wasn't conscious of the fact, well, I mean, I'd already decided what I was and done it long since. But I wasn't conscious of there being these other options opening up. So when people started to express far more openly that I'm non-binary, or I'm this or I'm that, I thought, oh, hang on, I'm going to have to learn about this stuff, because I don't know what they're talking about, but I ought to find out. And I saw that as a very positive thing, because we're moving from living within the silos given to us by other people to actually carving spaces which were much more flexible and porous, that real people could explore and find where they fit. So I think one of the big things that marks a difference between my generation and your generation is that younger trans people now have grown up being very aware that there are so many more options for what you can be and how you can do it and how you can transition. And it doesn't have to be built around pleasing a doctor, and it doesn't have to be about jumping through that hoop. Whereas our options in the 70s were very, very much more tightly constrained. And it's possible, looking back, to think that some of my identity then was framed very much by conforming with what the expectations of a doctor would be, than actually really discovering who I am. Now, as it turns out, luckily, who I am and what I was, my options were very close. But I still think, if I were having my time again now, I would probably emerge quite differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, it's funny because it's something, again, that I touch on in the transgender issue, is that the odd, when we speak about feminism and gender, is that this odd, this kind of constant, canard put to trans people is that, especially trans women, but all trans people, trans men and trans women, that we uphold gender stereotypes. And as I kind of say in the book, well, yes, actually, it was quite a requirement to uphold gender stereotypes. So, like, the best.
We're pinned to the floor by gender stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those things, were imposed by doctors, and also are still imposed by society. Anyway, it so annoys me when I go on Twitter or whatever, and people sort of talk about upholding gender stereotypes, because the reality is it's still, in a lot of parts of society, your whole way of proving that your transition is serious, or that you're taking it seriously, or that you is about how much you conform to gender stereotypes. I mean, it just is, and that's something that trans people didn't pick or ask for. And then the trans people who are more experimental or playful with gender, or more non-conforming, that they're treated with a different kind of suspicion. So really, it's a kind of a catch-22 that I
remember some of the cases that came to us in the sort of around about 2000, when people knew we were there and could write to us and say, can you help me with this? And there were a number of cases of people who trans women who had got appointments with the Charing Cross Gender Identity Clinic, and they turned up in jeans and a sweater, just like the receptionist at Charing Cross. And the doctors said, I can't treat you because you're not serious about your gender transition because you're wearing trousers. And I remember actually I had to get the lawyers at Liberty, to get onto some of these cases and actually put the fear of God into the doctors, because it was that old-fashioned, I guess. They were making the gender stereotypes that trans people had to follow. It's laughable that people think got it arse about face. They think it's the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. We almost are going to questions, aren't we? I'm just just before we do, I thought one thing to end on before we go to some questions is about a tone of positivity, because you sort of said about the winning hearts and minds periods, that, and it's easy to reflect on the backlash in the media and in the traditional media. I think it's worth saying print media is dying, which, like, unfortunately, I'm not going to be crying any tears over it. So while we focus on a lot on, you know, there could be a lot of the terrible headlines that are existing about trans people in the UK in particular right now, actually the impact of those is changing. And I think as we said with our books and with other people's trans people's books that are coming out, people do have more platforms for themselves. I also I've just written a piece for British Vogue that was out this month, looking at trans creatives in London and around the UK, and that was in fashion and the arts and theatre, people like Travis Albanza and the actors in their plays. And actually, when I was taking stock of it for that article, trans people really are in the culture and arts, really have emerged and come a huge way in terms of making their own work, producing their own work. And I think it's easy with the institutional attacks you see that are very, very visible and magnified by the media and everyone sort of talking to each other, frankly, in a circle jerk, and like, you know, BBC and Radio 4 and they've all seemed to actually, if you look kind of outside of that bubble, I feel like trans people actually are making quite a big cultural impact. I mean, actually the teenage show, I'm sure lots of people, I don't know, who are watching will know that like all of social media at the moment, watching Euphoria in the US, it's like probably one of the most watched youth shows amongst young people so far this year. And it stars Hunter Schafer, who is, you know, trans herself, transitioned quite young, and is playing a trans character, and it's a flawed trans character, and the fact that she's trans is actually largely irrelevant. And it's like the biggest teen show either side of the Atlantic. I mean, that's just, it's a real, I don't know, it's a million miles away from what media was out there when I was a teenager, and I'm sure even more so from what was around when you were a teenager. And I think it's really just worth pointing out that, you know, all of that stuff isn't, as much as visibility politics won't do all the work and it won't save everyone, it's still a huge thing in terms of winning cultural acceptance and a level of normalization. And I think I really am quite optimistic as a result of my book coming out and all these things that I'm mentioning now, that certainly the level of social acceptance in 10 years and 20 years, I think, will be markedly different to what it certainly was when I can speak for myself when I was growing up.
I only have to think about where we were in 2015 before our progress was effectively and very rudely derailed. We were making that progress. People saw, I remember actually one of the things that really struck me when I was doing the introduction to Trans Britain was just how many trans models there were. And I know that's sort of upholding a particularly possibly toxic model of femininity, but it is very much part of the culture. Let's face it, because gender people are a lot more obsessed about sex and appearances and those things than we are. I would freely admit that I haven't had sex since 2004 on a dirty weekend in Paris, and that was just to celebrate the Gender Recognition Act, and I've not needed to.
Is that true?
It's true. Because I've got better things to do, honestly.
No, but I meant that it was to celebrate the Gender Recognition.
Yes, my boyfriend at the time said we must go abroad, we must go and celebrate, and so we went to Paris, and it was steaming hot, and actually it was so hot that I didn't want to have sex anyway, so we just lay on top of the bed and talked, and came back having had the most uneventful dirty weekend you can imagine. But that marked my future since, and I've never never had the desire, because I find that people are, they bring too much hassle into your life. I prefer to have a nicely structured life where I can put things down and know where they'll be, and not have to argue over what goes in the washing machine. And so anyway, this is too much information, isn't it? but I guess I'm saying that just to stress the fact that while people, I think, have been brought up to think that because people change their gender, they must be obsessed about sex, they couldn't be further from the truth.
I see now where you were going with that. I was like, have that digression, share that gossip. That's going to be all over the internet tomorrow, isn't it? No, I mean, and that does make sense. I mean, certainly, yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you were saying, and again, I think it plays out differently for trans men and trans women. I think trans women get hypersexualized and trans men often get desexualized completely by society. I'm not saying that they don't, you know, in their personal lives have sex lives, but there's this kind of, it goes back right to what you were saying at the beginning about Christian Jorgensen and how trans women have been kind of portrayed in the media and sexualized in the media, which is again something I discuss in the chapter on feminism, which is very interesting because it comes from misogyny and it comes from the fact that femininity is like treated as more spectacular, codified, commodified more. So it's almost as if we're being treated like women, but I'm sure that that's not, there must be another reason why there's so much hypersexualization of trans women. Should we go to some questions?
Yes. Wonderful.
Goodness, it's so difficult to interrupt such an amazing and necessary conversation. It's like, if I was allowed to just let you go all evening, then I would, but I don't think we can we? So I've been looking at the questions coming in over the course of the event, and we do have several questions that you've actually answered already.
Good.
Which I would love to see it, frankly. And also quite a lot of the questions are the same question.
Okay.
It's the same question.
My phone number?
Oh. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask that. So the question is, if I'm going to go for the one that's the most sort of condensed, you know, to the sort of the essence of the question is, if changing social attitudes towards trans people is the fundamental goal, what can allies do to help achieve this? What can the cis lesbians, gay men, parents of trans people, what can they do materially to shore up the activist efforts of trans people? Because trans people, they also have other stuff that they want to be doing, like getting on with their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I guess yeah, I mean, that question comes up a lot. And I think it's worth, yeah, I think it's worth saying, first of all, is that probably everyone, it really depends, but every person usually has some sort of sphere of influence in their own lives, whether that's their child's school, whether that's their workplace, whether that's like, I don't know, community group they run, you know, it could be anything. But most of us have it, or it could be online, whatever. Most of us have some sort of sphere of influence, be that greater or smaller. And I think it's good to focus on how you, firstly, yeah, how you make that space welcoming to trans people in general, and consider perhaps, yeah, whether or not, what the experience of trans people in that arena might be before there's a trans person known to you in it. I always say that because people assume that with transphobia that you only tackle it when it's already happened, but in reality there's lots of preventative things that can be done. So I think that's a big part of it. I think, well, yeah, the trouble is it's such a broad question. In terms of, I mean, I do think it's good, and now there are educational tools like mine and Christine's books. I do think it's very helpful when people kind of like, there are obviously people, I know from the fact, like when I've had cisgender friends or boyfriends or whoever, who most people will hear transphobic things still around them. And I think it's worth saying that it's worth challenging the whole time. But it's also about taking responsibility for making sure that you're well informed enough to be able to challenge robustly friends and family members, perhaps their ignorance, perhaps the misinformation. It doesn't have to be like giving them a lecture and hectoring them. It can sometimes be like, actually, that's not the case. You know, you might have read this in the Times, but that's not the case. I think it's really important to do that and to challenge that. So challenging misinformation in your own sphere of influence, thinking about how to make your own sphere of influence. And I keep saying that phrase, sphere of influence, but you know, your workplace, your local community, to think about whether or not it's already a welcoming space for someone that might be struggling as a trans person. And then, yeah, I think the other thing it's worth saying is thinking about, you can fundraise for charities. There's AKT that does work, and Stonewall Housing in London, Gallup, the LGBT plus hate crime and discrimination charity. You know, I think it's worth saying that, like, given what we said about the sort of deterioration in the social safety net, the charitable sector is picking up a lot of the slack for the whole LGBT community, but trans people are often overrepresented in those most vulnerable areas: homelessness, mental health, etc. Yeah, a lot of those organizations have had a tough time with COVID, and I think it's really worth thinking about, you know, it's not about, you don't have to write out remortgage your home, but thinking about creative ways of fundraising. The Good Law Project that we've mentioned a few times here is funding litigation. There are lots of things that practical things that could be done there for allies beyond, because I just think everyone gets told, make sure you put your pronouns in your email signature, and make sure there's a gender neutral toilet, and then we can pack it up. Actually, I think there's still a lot more that people could be doing.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. So
no, good. Comprehensive.
Yeah, that's sorted that one out. I've put some links to some of the charities that you just mentioned into the chat, but because I didn't type as quickly as you said them, I missed some, for which I can really only apologize, and I'll ask you later. I actually think it'd be pretty good to like circulate them in the follow-up email after the event, actually.
Well, I could add to that list then, Gendered Intelligence, who do fantastic work, Mermaids, of course, who get a lot of the anti-trans stick, and in Scotland, the Scottish Transgender Alliance as well. So, you know, there's no shortage of choice for where to stick your support.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. We'll circulate some of those after the event. Some of them, all of them, actually. I've got another question, and this one's both related and also slightly back to the book. I had an absolutely lovely encounter in my local Boo Avenue.
Very nice.
When I walked in carrying Shon's book, brackets, I just bought it. The manager's son is dating a non-binary person, and she was incredibly proud and loving of them both, but also desperate to learn more and get it right without offending anyone in the process. Did either or both of you write your books with that kind of audience in mind? And if so, how did it inform your writing?
Shall I start? I think the audience, I think there were two audiences that I had in mind. I thought first, obviously, that trans people deserved to have somebody tell them their history. In my day as a young trans person, I learned at the knee of people in support groups. That happens less nowadays, and I thought it was important to actually have a coherent story told largely by trans people, for trans people. But there was a much bigger audience I had in mind as well, which was, in my mind's eye, it was the sort of people who thought they would like to be an ally or a better ally, but particularly because there was this perceived toxicity about saying anything about trans, and it was already a received view that to say something and get it wrong online particularly could get you into trouble. And it was, you know, so it was probably easier for people to say nothing and hope somebody else said it than to actually take the chance and stick their neck out. So I was writing very much for that constituency of people. And my instructions to the contributors were not to use any words that they didn't explain, not to wave fingers at anybody. And by structuring it that people were really telling it from their own personal perspective, meant that the story emerged from their experiences rather than there being somebody sitting there and lecturing on the subject and saying, now you must understand that this happened before that happened, and so on. So those are my two audiences, and I think they both seem to have worked. far as I'm concerned. Somebody might email me tonight, tell me I've got it terribly wrong, but I think that I was trying to hit two goals in one, and I hope I succeeded.
Yeah, that's great. That's so interesting. And yeah, it's the person who asked that. Well, first, I hope your purchase at Boo Avenue was very glamorous. Secondly, was that what I was thinking about when I wrote it? Yes. And similar to Christine, I suppose, yeah, there were a couple of different people. And actually, it was one of the harder things that, especially as it was my first book, obviously, never having written anything of that length before. It was one of the anxieties I had on the occasional catch-ups with my editor, was when I was really lost in the writing. It was like, who is this when you become sort of like, when you work with a text for so long and you write, and I was writing every day at one point, at my most active on it, and you just start to not be able to see it as an objective thing because you're kind of living and breathing it. And I was like, I had a couple of like mini crises about who am I writing this to? Who am I being too obscure? Am I being too patronizing? You know, so I think the core audience I was thinking about is, obviously I wanted this to be a mass marketable book. So while I wanted trans people to read it, obviously I recognized actually a lot of what would be in it would be stuff that a lot of trans people would know already. So it was actually aimed at like a mass audience. And in that, I think the key group I sort of hoped to get was, yes, the group who were the silent majority, because I think the vast majority of people do not care about trans people either way, because if it's not affecting you, I mean, that's how human beings are, if we're being realistic. We get like a small number of committed enemies and probably a relatively small number of committed allies, and then everyone else just floats somewhere in the middle. However, there is a bit of a recruitment drive on the enemy side to try and get more people at least aligned in private to their views. And I didn't feel that there was like anything pulling people more to our side to be like crass about it. So I had to kind of, I thought about writing for that, if you like, silent majority, on the basis that just how the market works is that I recognized that there was this whole genre of political nonfiction that had been very successful, particularly around race. People like Renegado Lodge, with the Why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, is that as print media and broadsheet newspapers are dropping in circulation, that section of books have grown and grown, and actually the pandemic has actually made the books market increase even more, and people are turning to like specialist nonfiction more and more because of the declining quality in newspapers. I think people need, are turning to specialist nonfiction to educate themselves on a range of issues because of fake news, basically, and because of a lack of diversity in the media. And so I wanted to pull across the people who would only maybe read one book. They felt that it was toxic. They didn't really understand it. Maybe their kids had brought up trans people at school or whatever, and they would read one book on the topic. And that's kind of what part of the fact that transgender is in the title is like, this will be my one book to try and understand the topic. And I wanted to capture that group. But that said, so that was primarily who, and that sounds a bit like the person in Boo Avenue, potentially. The other group I guess I was thinking about was, yes, trans people, but also, the people who are already allies or disposed to be allies already are, but to challenge them a bit further. And this is where the left, the fact that I'm a socialist and a left winger comes in, is that I wanted them more to do just like, not the like hashtag trans rights or human rights, but to think a little bit more about, we're in a time of like huge right-wing resurgence, huge time of social conservatism, anti-immigrant sentiment, climate crisis, all this stuff. All these politics matter to me as much as trans politics. And actually to kind of be like, well, actually, I'm going to use trans politics and kind of, we need to be a bit more ambitious and think about how this fits into like the wider world, and not just about the rights of this one group, but about a bigger social project. And that social project affects everything from prisons to schools to the nation state and our borders and everything like that. And so that was like a second strain, was pushing people who already got I'll call you she, if that's what you want to be called, all that stuff, all the sort of like trans rights or human rights people, is to push them a little bit further and challenge them. because I didn't feel that there was like a solid left-wing text that people could refer to that frame trans rights within that broader progressive context. Sorry, a very long answer, but that's who I was aiming it for, and the person in Boo Avenue.
So I've got someone saying that they can't wait for the transgender agenda to be available in Mexico. Thank you very much. So it's so cool to see people joining from all over the world.
Shon, you've been translated into some other languages, haven't you? Are you in Spanish?
Yes, I have. So it's already, yes. So I've signed translation deals into 5 languages that aren't English. And so far it's been published in Spain. It was published in Spain last week or the week before. And it was actually translated by a trans woman, Rosa Maria Garcia, who is 26, so quite young. And also, a Marxist trans woman. So it's really great that obviously the publisher in Spain managed to find a trans translator. And I am going to Barcelona in about 3 weeks to do an event there. And I've just been doing some press with the Spanish press. So that's all very exciting, but we've still got Italian, Japanese, Korean, and German to come out. So yeah, very exciting.
It is. It's exciting. I'm ready for it. So the question I have for you next is one I keep coming back to because it's quite a good one. Firstly, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. How do we balance the need to remain focused and not to get distracted by the backlash with the need to avoid further radicalization in spaces that can have an impact on trans health and well-being and rights? The context for this is the inquirer is a cis woman working in violence against women sector and has seen many radicalized colleagues, which of course then directly impacts on the access of trans people to services.
Well, can I kick us off?
Yeah,
I think the crucial thing in making progress there is to understand the smoke and mirrors. Firstly, the press play smoke and mirrors. Every month I publish the audited distribution numbers for the British mainstream media, and they are all plummeting. The Guardian has probably gone well below 100,000 by now. So every time people see something in one of those newspapers and freak out about it, it's worth remembering that certainly in terms of print, it has got very, very little impact. And we are part of them trying to maintain their audience by having something for people to get worked up against. But also the people making this into a cultural moment are very small in number as well. I have a block list on Twitter of around about 5,500 people. It's grown a little bit over the years, but it's not grown dramatically. And every time I see somebody being piled on, then I go and look at the replies that are supposed to be causing all the trouble. And almost all of them I can't see. So that says to me that the people trying to give the impression that there is a big controversy going on in British Twitter are working within the small set of people that I have blocked. Ergo, the size of this movement is a lot smaller than it makes out. So keeping that in mind helps you, I think, to take a step back and say, in terms of making the progress that we want to make, the sort of things that Shon identifies in her book, is bearing in mind we should not let ourselves be led by this noise, because that's not where the real conversation is. And also they're not making gains. There's been all this noise and this nonsense and court cases. They haven't yet, as far as I'm aware, they haven't changed one single law. They might have frightened a few public bodies into to putting their policies on the back shelf. They might have made a lot of controversy and fear, but actually they've made far less progress than the amount of noise would suggest that they made. And in terms coming back to the press, of course, people will come back to me and say, well, of course, it's not just print now. When something is published in, let's say, the Times, then thousands of people read it online. But they only read it online because somebody has shared that article because they are shocked or incensed by it. And if they didn't share that article, then nobody would be talking about it, because online media work completely different to the newspapers. I'm an old-fashioned old woman, and I'd started in the newspaper on the front page, and I'd work through. And as soon as it got to the sport, then I'd close it and put it in the recycling. You discover things organically by turning the pages. That doesn't happen online unless you are a very dedicated reader of that publication. Most people get what they think is in the online papers by seeing what people have posted. So that's why it is controversial, because they want people to do that. And if we stop doing that, then that trick doesn't work anymore, and they will decline even further. So the thing that keeps me grounded and allows, hopefully, should allow us to remain concentrating on our agenda rather than theirs, is to remember that this is the howling of a dying industry, and we shouldn't help them to continue to get advertising by pointing out their worst excesses. Shon.
Yeah, and I think I'll answer the question in a different way to Christine. Because the person who asked the question mentioned about colleagues in the violence against women sector. So that's the sort of specific context about how the places where this information is having an impact. I guess I can only speak for what my approach on this is that, I'm a writer. The job of a writer is to tell stories. In politics as well, any kind of politics, you're kind of about telling, if you want to win people over or to stop people engaging in bigotry, or you want to convince people, is about telling the right story. And I do genuinely think there's lots of research to back it up, but there is genuinely, when you're being reactive in politics, in storytelling, you tend to already be on the back foot. You tend to have already lost. Mm. And so, for example, one thing, and this is something I try to do in the book, is is to look at, so if you look at the violence against women sector, that's one of the, this idea of women's services, refuges have become one of these huge sites of controversy in this whole quote unquote debate. Where I would come to that is flip it on its head, is what we never hear, and perhaps maybe the colleagues that you refer to haven't had a chance to hear, is the experiences, because presumably it's about trans women and trans feminine survivors of violence that the fear mongering has been about, or this fear is about. And what you hear is this abstract anxiety about the presence of trans women in these services. What the story that's never told is the story of the trans woman or trans feminine survivor, of which there are many, about trans women's experiences of gender-based violence. That's completely disregarded, and the trans woman or trans person in this context becomes not a real person. They become I guess a talking point, or a conceptual problem, or really an imaginary enemy, when in fact the real stories of trans women survivors, actually anyone who read them or heard them would realize how similar the patterns of gender-based violence against trans women and cis women are. So in the book, what I try to do is less argue a myth busting about this, and more about, well, here is why trans women need these services. And I think, most people then you'd have to be pretty radicalized to not concede that these patterns of gender-based violence are the same, and that clearly trans women, the perpetrators are often the same for trans women and cis women, and and that trans women are owed some kind of support and solidarity from the sector. And the trouble is, there just isn't enough opportunity to do that. I mean, I think Galdem did a very good piece about discriminatory views in the violence against women sector last year. I think it was, Moya Lothian-McLean who did a very good investigative report and actually reported on, like, you know, people within the sector about the transphobic attitudes they'd heard. And I actually think when people had an opportunity to see that level of discrimination as it played out, report in front of them within the sector, and the kind of culture of often kind of quiet intimidation of younger or more inclusive women in that sector, cisgender women, people were quite shocked by it. I remember that article got a lot of traction. So for me, it's a lot more about telling the story that's not being told and winning people over that way, because then you start to have the conversation on your own terms, not on reactive terms where already the terms have already been decided. The trouble is once you're already arguing about whether or not trans women are predatory, that's already in people's minds. What actually the reality is trans women are much more likely to be victims of gender-based violence, and that is never part of the discussion in the mainstream. So it's about kind of reorienting the discussion more to reality, which is, what is the experience of being a trans feminine survivor? Why are trans women more likely to be survivors of domestic violence? Because they're isolated, because of their financial prospects, because they don't have as good family contacts, because they have low self-worth that are like a perpetrator can manipulate. You know, all of these things are not necessarily obvious to people who don't see trans women in, you know, in their day-to-day lives. And so really, you know, just still have that mental image of, like, I don't know, basically a man having no context of like how gender-based violence operates. And so for me, it's about counteracting that sort of stuff is by telling people a new story, one that I would argue is still closer to the truth, but a different and more invigorating story that changes their perspective nonetheless. And that's what I've set out to do, more or less successfully. I'll let other people be the judge.
That actually brings us very precisely to 7:01. There are so many questions here that we have not got around to, but I think that's only to be expected when you've got two good speakers and some things that people are interested in, and, you know, a good way of going through all of them. So I would like to thank you both for joining me this evening, and thank you for your time and your work and your eloquence on taking on some very pertinent and potent topics. And I've certainly taken on some new information that I'm going to be implementing later myself. Doubtless that'll be the case for the rest of the audience as well. I wonder if either of you have any sort of closing reflections to end on. I'm still just thinking about what Shon just ended on, and I just think it's just fantastic about the role of narrative and story and how you control it. So either of you wish to do that? That would be cool, and then I can sign us all off for the night. Let's go with Christine first.
I think it's so frustrating that so many people are hoodwinked into the distraction of thinking that we're the biggest problem in their lives, when, you know, we are en route to making the planet uninhabitable. And, you know, America is grappling rather ineffectually with the possibility of going full fascist. You know, there are bigger problems in the world than whether I pee in the cubicle next to you, which I've been doing for a good, I don't know, 35 years or more, and I've never had any complaints. So yeah, I wish that we could, you know, stop this ridiculous diversion, which is invented and confected and created with the purpose of distracting people from, you know, being critical of having a lying, deceitful, disastrous prime minister, and other things that should be uniting all of us in trying to get our societies back on track and save something for the next generation. It is just so annoying that so much energy has to be put into this entirely made up panic.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I would probably add to that. Yeah, it's LGBT History Month. We are two authors. I would say to people who are looking to like lift their spirits it's always worth, I mean, you don't have to be as drastic as me and blow up your Twitter completely, but it's always worth coming offline and yeah, reading books. And I think history, actually, LGBT history, trans history, there's Christine's book. There is one from the Vaults, a podcast by Morgan Page, which is a trans history podcast, kind of told in a very entertaining way. There's my podcast, Call Me Mother. There's loads of things I could be recommending. And I think it's worth like dipping into bits of history, because I think it will surprise, I think anyone that's feeling down or a bit depressed about where we're at will realize that there have always been people here before and have faced similar challenges, sometimes worse challenges, sometimes different challenges, but actually there's nothing new under the sun. History can surprise you sometimes too about what people were able to achieve when actually you think that the conditions around them were unsettling. I mean, like last year I saw Georgina Bayer, who was the first out trans MP in the world, and she was elected in the Bible Belt in 1999 and was a former sex worker, and she was elected by a really conservative constituency. All of these history can really surprise you about what people were capable of. And I think that's definitely a note to take for LGBT History Month, is it's very easy, and social media is inclined to keep us addicted to a news cycle that's designed to kind of keep us hooked and anxious and depressed and looking for more evidence that everything is terrible. And I think it's worth taking a break from that and looking maybe to the past to consider different ways of looking at the future and how we get there. And I think that's what my note to end on would be, considering it's February the 1st.
I couldn't have said it better. That's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you. I guess that's all that's left really, is to remind you that if you're in Cambridge, you can pop along to Heifers outside of Trinity for a very generous 20% off both Shon and Christine's books, which has the added benefit of you going to a nice brick and mortar shop and not being online. But if you are joining us from somewhere else, because I realise that there are probably other places other than the small town that I live in, you can pop online to queerlit.co.uk for a 10% discount. There is a nice code in the emails that I sent you earlier. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was this has been really special. This has been really valuable. I've popped links in the chat to various things that you've either mentioned, things that you can then go forth and look at later. The program that I run, I guess, that coordinate the Q+, we've got an event coming up on the 8th of February, which is Overlapping Activisms, which will be looking at points of potential contention and conflict between different spheres of activism. So that's I popped that in the chat because it was quite pertinent to the discussion that was going on at the time, and it's pertinent afterwards as well. Thank you very much, Shon Faye and Christine Burns, for joining me, and also thanks to all of our enormous audience this evening for joining us for this conversation. That's all I have.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for having us. Thank you for everyone who watched. I know that Zoom events at this stage in the pandemic are probably a bit of a chore. So I'm very pleased with how many people decided to spend their Tuesday evening watching this.
Tuesday evening. Yes, thank you very much. I hope you all have a nice evening.
Thanks.
I release you into the world.
Bye.